Last year, 8 Cuban children in need of liver transplants had to wait months on end to receive new organs. The surgeons in Cuba were in need of custodial, which is a solution preserving the viability of organs in transport. They were unable to procure custodial directly from the United States as a direct consequence of the blockade on Cuba. It took the solidarity and initiative of 2 peace activist organizations, Bridges of Love and the Code Pink organization, to raise $25,000 to procure the solution from US corporations. The corporations, when they found out that their product was going to Cuba, initially backed off for fear of legal repercussions. But fortunately, the organizations were able to procure the solution and send it to Cuba on humanitarian missions, saving the lives of those children. I understand when I talk about blockade and embargo and international law from the outset, it can seem too complex. But understand when I talk about blockade, I'm talking about suffocation, I'm talking about deprivation, I'm talking about hunger, and I'm talking about death. This criminal blockade going on for 60 years, condemned by a majority of the world population for 30 consecutive years, cripples the Cuban economy and denies them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most of us here were either born in America or been here long enough to know that life, liberty, and happiness are foundational principles for our country. What then gives us the right to deny a population of 11 million people the same pursuit? And shouldn't we, as citizens of the free world, have the right to travel where we wish, to trade with whom we wish, and to connect with whom we wish? And don't Cuban citizens, human beings like you and I, have the same right? The fact of the matter is that they don't, or rather that they can't, because the blockade impedes their economic development and impedes on their quality of life. The only solution is ending the blockade and normalizing diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. The benefits would be towards Cuban economic development. It would benefit US businesses, it would improve Cuban living standards, and it would provide American citizens access to Cuban biotechnology. In a review by 2 Stanford professors, Paul K. Drain and Michelle Berry, studying the impact of the Cuban embargo on Cuban health, they point to 2 acts which I've mentioned before in my prior speeches. The Torricelli Act, which bans US subsidiaries from trading with Cuba, and the Helms-Burton Act, which penalizes foreign companies from trading with Cuba. They state, quote, before Torricelli, Cuban imports from the United States were up to $719 million a year, 90% of which was food and medicine. But between 1992 and 1995, the imposition of the Torricelli Act, only $300,000 was approved for sale from US subsidiaries. Medical shortages were associated with a 48% increase in tuberculosis deaths from 1992 to 1993. Tuberculosis cases in 1995 were 3 times that of 1990. Diarrheal diseases were increased between 1993 and 1994. And in 1994, there was an outbreak of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is when your autoimmune system attacks your peripheral nervous system as a result of contaminated water following a chlorination shortage. Although establishing causality is difficult, US trade sanctions altered medication supply and likely had focal and serious consequences on Cuban health, end quote. As I mentioned, the blockade cripples the Cuban economy, costing the country $130 to $144 billion since the imposition of the blockade, but it also negatively affects US businesses. A 2015 report by the US Chamber of Commerce states, quote, the US International Trade Commission estimated in 2001 the Cuban embargo costs American exporters up to $1.2 billion in lost sales a year. This sum has likely grown over the past 14 years as US exports have increased by 123%. Nicole Wadley, writing for the Atlantic Council, summarizes the simple solution. Quote, by allowing US citizens and companies to invest in Cuba and permit US citizens to travel to Cuba and spend tourist dollars at entrepreneur-owned businesses would direct income flow to entrepreneurs, end quote, allowing US businesses to capitalize on Cuba's emerging private sector. Despite biotechnology import restrictions, Cuba is the first country to develop a vaccine for lung cancer called CIMAVAX. Lung cancer is the leading cause of death amongst cancer patients, but CIMAVAX is not available to Americans as a direct consequence of the blockade, except for those admitted into the Roswell Institute's clinical trial in Buffalo, but only for Americans who have lived in Buffalo for an extended period. By ending the blockade, American lung cancer patients who only have access to aggressive and non-specific forms of treatment would have access to a simple vaccine proven to increase the lifespan of lung cancer patients by 5 months. In a USA Today article from January 9th, 2018 by Sally Jacobs, Jacobs interviews a man named George Keyes who has stage 4 lung cancer, who traveled to Cuba, quote, despite federal law that prohibits Americans from going there for healthcare, end quote, to receive the vaccine. Under the Trump administration, greater restrictions on travel to Cuba were put in place, and this put George Keyes in a predicament, stating, quote, "I'm not looking to break the law, but I'm not looking to die either. People with stage 4 cancer like me should be allowed to try whatever they want to stay alive. The last thing they need is the government on your neck over some archaic regulation saying just take what is available here and die." This cruel and unusual policy taken by the United States against Cuba cripples the Cuban economy, costs potential US exporters up to $1 billion annually, and coupled with restricted life-saving medication technology for both Cubans and Americans, strangles Cuban health and quality of life. This immoral blockade is a stain on the United States for impeding the development of Cuba and putting the health and safety of both Cubans and Americans at risk. When you think of Cuba, when you think of the blockade, think of those 8 children waiting desperately in need of an organ transplant. Or if God forbid you get lung cancer and you're suffering through chemotherapy, when just 400 miles away there's a simple vaccine. The only thing you have to blame is the blockade. Thank you.